A difficult subject, so we will try to approach it together without too many philosophical concepts. But I will begin with those words: close reading, close writing, la philosophie à la lettre. Close reading is one major part of the philosophical method of Jacques Derrida. Close reading is the idea that you don't get directly to the major ideas in a text. Let's take, for example, a page of Nietzsche or a page of Plato's dialogues. You really read it as a text, closely, with every metaphor. And for example, with Plato, you consider that the form of dialogue and even the small details of the dialogues and the small examples or stories are essential, and you cannot go directly to the major ideas and to put them together. You have to read the text. Close writing is the second part. With Derrida, we had this idea. We can give it a little later, I think. Erika, it will be better to give the text later. It's more general. So, close writing is the idea that you can write a philosophical text as a text, not as literature, but with the same care, the same importance accorded to the world. This is, of course, very different from the tradition of philosophy in the Anglo-Saxon world, and for that reason, he was considered as the worst part of continental philosophy and rejected very often. But what means the idea of close writing is that every word is important in a philosophical text, and you can write it in a beautiful way and in a precise way. We can think to some other philosophers of the past, like Plato, as I said, but also Kierkegaard or Nietzsche. So writing was considered as an object from the beginning, an object for the meaning, and there was a close connection between Derrida and linguistics reflection at that time in the 60s. This book appeared in 67. Linguistics was very important for the literature studies, for psychoanalysis with Lacan, for anthropology with Lévi-Strauss, and of course for philosophy with Derrida. And one major book of Derrida appeared the same year, 67, in French, De la Grammatologie, and you probably know, if you know something about Derrida, that the influence of this book in the United States was essential. It was translated some years later by Gayatri Spivak, and she became very famous at that time for that translation, even if the translation was criticized a few years later and transformed and republished, but it was very, very important. And because in the book De la Grammatologie, of grammatology, the linguistics questions are central and essential. Of course, the translation was very, very important. And one other thing was important is that this book was very successful, but the English translation became the basis for many others' translations. So there were second-degree translation to Japanese, and then after to Chinese and different other languages. So it was a translation of a translation, and sometimes transforming one element and then one element, and so the text became totally different. And when Derrida traveled for the first time in China, Chinese academic authorities said, we want to translate every book of Derrida. And he asked, please take the French text, because it will be already very difficult with the French text. But if you take some mistakes, of the, or some ambiguities of the English version, then it will certainly be a disaster. And when some Japanese or Chinese people not reading French were speaking with him and say, "We love your books," he said, "What do you really love in them? Are you sure that you read them?" And for other philosophers, this can be a problem, but for Derrida, it's a major problem, major question. And so, for him, through his personal experiences, the question of translation became a philosophical problem, not only a technical problem. When he worked with English translators, Italian translators, German translators, he tried to discuss with them and to answer to the questions. Of course, when it was in Japanese, it was not so easy for him. But, for example, for the word deconstruction, he wrote a very long letter to a Japanese friend and explaining the background of this word deconstruction, which has close relation with the German words used by Heidegger of Abbau or Destruktion. But he tried to explain all the nuances, all the elements, and so he was able to write in this text, and I think this can be interesting for translator. The question of deconstruction is also through and through the question of translation. So he was really close to the French language. He liked this language, but he was very concerned with the diversity of languages and the possibility of communication. Is philosophy a question of language, or can we go behind the language question, and how? So this is to say that translating Derrida is also a Derridian problem. It's not only a question of difficulties, practical difficulties. And about Freud, for example, when he wrote about Freud, he was one of the first philosophers to speak very precisely of the text. He didn't want to go directly to the concept, but to read it as a text, to read it closely. The materiality of a word cannot be translated or carried over into another language. So there is an ideality of the word, of the concept of the sound, but there is also a materiality. Which type of word it is, which is this, the background of the word, the etymology, and so materiality is precisely that which translation relinquishes. In a way, it's automatic. To relinquish materiality, such is the driving force of translation. So, how can you manage with this problem? This is a question that was very, very important for him. I read a few words in French, and then the translation. It's a letter to a German translator of La Carte Postale, a sophisticated book with a lot of word plays and ambiguities and volunteer ambiguities. It's some elements of the postcard are close to literary writing. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt you. Are these slides going to be available to us?
The slides? In the PowerPoint, you will give it to us.
Yes.
So the students will be
Yes.
ready.
I can transmit it to Erika and then to you.
And secondly, could you explain what is meant by materiality?
A poet, for example, is working precisely with the letters, the rhythm of a word, the rhymes. This we can call materiality. For example, if you have a word with translation, deconstruction, you have some rhymes, and in certain language you can destroy, let's say, the parallel. Translation is part of deconstruction. If you have two words very different, some elements of the idea can be lost. Or if you take a word like mind or spirit, and you have in French esprit, you will lose very quickly some elements, some associations, some double meanings. This is between materiality and ideality. So I read it in French and then in English, even if it was written to a German translator. So we have already 3 languages. À lire vos questions. So questions about the translation. À lire vos questions. Je vois une fois encore que vous avez mieux lu le texte que moi. C'est pourquoi un traducteur est absolument insupportable, et meilleur il est, plus il fait peur. Le surmoi en personne est le premier auteur. On reading your questions, I see yet again that you have read the text better than I have. Close reading, but close reading by the patience of the translator. That's why the translator is absolutely unbearable, and the better he is, the scarier he is. The superego, of course, the Freudian concept of superego in person. So the author doesn't have the full meaning of the text. When you read it carefully to try to translate it, you can find some contradiction or strange things in the text. But of course, you also lose. And here there is a reference to the text published in English in Critical Inquiry in 2001, I think, but you can find it easily on internet. What is a relevant translation? So you see that the question of translation was really treated as a serious philosophical problem, and Derrida is speaking there about The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. So also different languages, Derrida going to an English text and trying to understand the difficulties of this text. But he is not speaking as a translator, but as a philosopher concerned by the question of languages and so concerned by the question of translation. And here a few lines, I read them even with my bad accent. A relevant translation is a translation that aims to attain the greatest possible relevance. Relevance is a translation that, while rendering the so-called proper meaning of a word, establishes as the law or ideal, even if it remains inaccessible, a kind of translating that stays as close as possible to the equivalence of one word by one word, which you know is impossible, but it's sort of ideal possibility, and thereby respects verbal quantity as a quantity of words, each of which is an irreducible body, the indivisible unity of an acoustic form that incorporates or signifies the indivisible unity of a meaning or concept. It could take 1 hour to really read this sentence, but you feel the problem. It's not just to translate the general basic idea of a sentence or a paragraph, but to really say, if I modify those words, if I use 3 words to translate 1 word, I'm losing something. And we will find examples in a few moments. And here let's take a very simple example, because it begins with a title of a book by Jacques Derrida, Demeure, Maurice Blanchot. This book is about a short story written by Maurice Blanchot, which is an important writer and literary critic in France, close to philosophy. Derrida wrote a lot about him. And here you see the American edition, I think. The text by Blanchot, L'instant de ma mort, the instant of my death, very close, no difficulty. Demeure, fiction and testimony, they have added it and they have suppressed the undertitle Maurice Blanchot. But the problem is demeure. Demeure in French has a fundamental ambiguity that makes the value of the title. Because demeure, it can be the name for a house, ma demeure, my home, let's say, in a way, it's a way to tell it. I live in a demeure. A demeure cannot be just a small apartment. It's more than a house. It's a certain idea of an old house. But demeurer is a verbal form, which means to stay, to remain as it is. So, je demeure persuadé. I'm still persuaded. But we can use many sentences with different meanings of this single word, demeure. And so, if I say to you, demeure, it's like if I was speaking to an animal, stay here, please stay here, don't move. But this meaning is connected with the other meaning, house, home, etc. I think that when you read it on the cover of a book, in English, you don't have the same feelings. You don't have the same poetic elements which are central in the analysis of the short story, the instance of my death. L'instant de ma mort is the instance where I have to stay, demeurer. You can speak about a tomb as ma dernière demeure. My last home is the place where I stay as a dead body. So you see many meanings and connections between demeure and death, but many other meanings. Of course, if it was a verbal form, impératif en français, we would have an exclamation sign, so demeure. Here we don't have it. So the ambiguity is total. It's not a verbal form, it's not a name, but it's directly appealing. When you see this on the cover of a book in French, you say, oh, what is it about? Very strange. And you can also read it in a second reading, demeure, Maurice Blanchot. Stay here, stay with us, Maurice Blanchot. We need you. Demeure. You have to be still what you are. Be as you are, continue to be as you are. You see so many meanings when you hear this other title, which is part of the text of Derrida, Demeure, Fiction and Testimony. The meaning is totally different. So from the beginning, from one book to another, the changes are not anecdotic, they are major. The meaning, the double meaning, the triple meaning are partially lost. And when we go to this major book by Derrida, one of his most famous and probably his strangest book, published in France in 1974, we have this title, Glas, no subtitle, no indication. We don't know exactly what it is. It's not the size of a philosophical book. It's some very strange object. You have to know that in the 70s in France there were a lot of experiences close to contemporary art and with new type of novels, nouveau roman, tel quel, and this type of things. So experimental writing. But normally in philosophy it was rare. If we look at Wikipedia for the meaning of Glas, we will see the beginning of our problems. The beginning of many problems. So it begins with only 4 letters. Le glas est la sonnerie de cloche, it's bell, signalant l'agonie, la mort ou les obsèques d'une personne. So it directly connected to the death, the instant of the death, like for Maurice Blanchot, or the ceremony of funeral. It's a bell music with only one repeated note to give to a village or a small town the feeling of an important death. Les obsèques d'une personne couramment infidèle chrétien, so Christian tradition, il peut être sonné entre le décès et les funérailles, so you can hear it between the death and the funeral, or during the funerals. We find a translation because I looked for the page Glas, and there was an English page about Glas, and they say a death knell was the ringing of a bell immediately after death to announce it. There is a novel by Hemingway which is called in French Pour qui sonne le glas? For whom the bell tells. So they used glas in the French translation, but they use only bells, and here we have death knell. So we see a lot of problems for the first word, but as we have read, Derrida says one word by one word, especially for a title. You cannot, and you will very easily see the disaster in a few minutes if we translated death knell or bells. It would be a complete disaster for many, many reasons. Here, it becomes worse, more complicated, and we will be, as potential translators, desperate. This is the first page of Glas. In this book, we have massively one column, one other column, continuing through 260 pages, through the whole book. One text is about a major philosopher, Hegel, and the other text is about a major writer, Jean Genet, major French writer. A German philosopher, a French writer. But as you can see, and this was published in 1974, it's not only two columns, there are also a lot of small text included in the columns. It could look like hypertext, but it was just done with a classical writing machine at that time, and then with the publisher very patiently. So it was done without any technique, and it was very difficult and important to get each page as Derrida wanted it to be, so they used white space to have some correspondence. Because at the beginning you can say, how will I read this? How will I read this text? Shall I continue here and the next page and then come back to the second column? But then why did Derrida did it that way? Or will I read them from one column to another? But I need to continue because here you have development continuing on the following page. So it's in a way technically almost impossible to read. We will go back to this point. So first, Hegel, major German philosopher of the beginning of 19th century, and one book of Hegel is the center of this analysis by Derrida, and it's a serious and important analysis of Grundlinien der Philosophie des Rechts, published in Berlin in 1821. So, philosophy of right, philosophy of the law, the spirit of the law and the right, as it is translated by Dover. And there are different translations of this classic, philosophical classic. So, the text of Derrida speaks a lot about this question of, let's say, the right in the family, the law connected to the question of family. This is a major concern in this text. But in the second text, we are speaking about a writer, not a philosopher, and this writer is an outlaw. He was an orphan, abandoned by his mother at his birth, and having a very, very difficult childhood, was put in jail when he was 14, and after writing and publishing some texts, he was protected by writers like Jean Cocteau or Jean-Paul Sartre, and was able to have a normal life as a writer. So you see, it's strictly the contrary of Hegel. Hegel, a classic philosopher speaking about law and family, and here an homosexual outlaw having a very strange life. So the connections between the two columns becomes a problem. And so he was published in France as a major writer for theater plays, and novels, and all other texts, and he was protected by Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote a giant introduction to his complete works, and the first volume of Jean Genet works is only the text by Jean-Paul Sartre. It was like a preface, but the preface became so big that the commentary chased, in a way, Genet from his own book. And so here are some books, some literary books by Genet, and we will see an element which is very important in these stories of men in jail and so difficulties to live and to survive, and memories of his childhood. We can see flowers, Notre Dame des Fleurs, and we can see other flowers here in Miracle de la Rose, the rose. So, an important poetic element entering already in the titles. Another element is Jean Genet, who stopped to write at a certain moment. After his success, he didn't want to write anymore for many years. He published one last text in the important cultural magazine Tel Quel, who Derrida also published. It was in 1967, the year of la grammatologie and l'écriture et la différence. And this text is ce qui est resté d'un Rembrandt, déchiré en petits carrés bien réguliers et foutu aux chiottes. Chiottes is a very yes, a very bad word for toilets. It's not known. Ce qui est resté d'un Rembrandt, this is a very high-level language, and chiotte is really for prisoners, for kids. And this text, which is about a destroyed text by Genet, only a few parts survived. This text is in 2 columns, and it was done by Genet some years before Derrida. So let's go back to this page of Glas. I think you have received a copy. And before trying to translate this page, we have to understand some elements of the background, because if you just take the pages here, I have to translate it for tomorrow, quick, you will probably have a total disaster. It begins very strangely in the middle of a sentence, like James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, which was a major influence to Derrida. Derrida loved literature and was very impressed by Joyce. And it begins, quoi du reste aujourd'hui pour nous, ici, maintenant, d'un Hegel. It's not a complete sentence, and you don't have a capital letter at the beginning. You don't either have a capital letter at the beginning of the second sentence. And at the end of the book, 260 pages later, it will also be cut. interrupted. And maybe you can describe the whole book as a circle continuing from the last page to the first page, like in Joyce's text. This is the first difficulty. You are between philosophy and poetry, or let's say literature. So you have to consider the materiality of every element and to think that probably there is something serious between those two texts. This is first element. And so I just show some details, very easy. We could show 10 elements of this, but this is just a present of reste et resté in both columns. Quoi du reste? Erika, how would you translate du reste, which is like d'ailleurs?
What about?
Yeah, du reste is a small word that at all or something like that. But it's in direct connection with the title of the Genet's text. Ce qui est resté d'un Rembrandt is divided in two, says Derrida. So he's describing his own page, comme le reste. So as everything. And you will see that reste, resté, du reste has different meanings in the text, but it's the same words. And for example, here, qui, lui, who, him, and as a rest. So direct connection from one question to another. Qui, lui, Hegel or Genet? We don't know. So this is just one element, and maybe I have forgotten some of them. But you just see, if you have one translator for Hegel and one translator for Genet, maybe they will forget this element and destroy a lot of things and destroy a lot of relations. Here we will take another example, only in the left column, which is a lot of wordplays about the name Hegel. Hegel, this is the German pronunciation. How do you say it in English? Hegel, with the H is not as present as in German, but Hegel. And in French, we say often Hegel. At the 1 century ago, maybe people said Hegel, but now we say, okay, Hegel. Hegel. But Hegel is very close to the word eagle. Eagle. Son nom est si étrange. De l'aigle, il tient la puissance impériale. L'aigle, the eagle, it was also Napoleon, who was a contemporary of Hegel, and Hegel was impressed by the story, the saga of Napoleon. So it's not only a question of playing with the resemblance between Aigle and Hegel, but also a question of history. And then we will see some anagrammatic things that you can accept or not accept, but there are so many that at a certain moment you have to consider that it was an element in writing. For example, Glas et gel. You find the name of Hegel piece by piece, letter by letter, Sigle. Sigle. It's all the letters except the H. And so, legend is very close to Hegel also. But at a certain moment, you have to stop and say, is it really anagrammatic, or is it just a sound effect, or is it just a literate effect? Where to stop? What is certain, and is that you see that there are some common letters between Genet and Hegel. Same letters. G-E-N-E-T. Hegel. H-E-G-E-L. 5 letters for both. So you see this type of correspondence, some conscious, some unconscious. I think a lot are here very conscious for Derrida. And then we go back to the title. And we see that the title is creating a lot of words connected to it. Glial is a flower, glycine is a flower, eglantine is a flower, and then we have other words. I cannot explain all of them, but they are coming and be used in the text. Gabrielle, for example, was the first name of the mother of Jeanette. It was discovered later. His mother was Gabrielle, and Gabrielle is used a lot. So Gabrielle and Hegel and Galerian. Galerian is a prisoner on a boat. And he was not a Galerian, but he was a sort of Galerian in his prison. And Glas is more philosophical, speaking about something, especially in the Jewish tradition. The commentary of a commentary, it can be called Glas, Golgotha, in the Christian tradition. But more extraordinary, Galilei. Galilei, not only Galileus, the scientist, but the publisher of the book. Glas, Galilei, Hegel, very close. So this is, of course, impossible to translate because it was part of the element, maybe of the choice of the publisher. It was the first book of Derrida with Galilei, but you have the same type of thing with Beckett, published by Minuit, Édition de Minuit, and a lot of wordplays between Beckett's text and the word minuit, midnight. So this is just to give some elements. And we were on page 1, but you have, of course, so many other pages of a book. So you will discover and discover many, many difficulties. But the text was translated in English in the 80s. Two translators, John P. Levy Jr. and Richard Rand, 2 columns, 2 translators. They had to keep the title. It was impossible to change it, first decision. And I think the book is almost impossible to find, so I just choose some elements on page. They respected the format of the book, the size, because it was impossible to change it. If you publish one text and then the other, it would be absurd. It would ruin the whole project. And it begins with a note to the translation. I will not read you the whole text, but they say the translation of Glas was a joint effort. 2 columns, 2 translators. Richard Rand provided the first draft translation of the column on Georgenet, and I of the column on Hegel. It's funny because they were 2 to do the translation, but one is signing this note. And they express the idea of the many, many difficulties that they had to manage with, and also a secondary difficulty, which is the place of the German language in the Hegel's text quoted by Derrida, because sometimes he goes back to German and is discussing, we will find an example in a few minutes, he is discussing a specific meaning of a term in Hegelian German and in French, and then you have to translate the difficulty to get from German to French and to English. And so we see the first page, and we see that in a way they respect it. They respect it seriously, but what we can directly see, if we look closely, is that they have to add some words to explain certain things. as there remains rest, to put one word of the original text, or here, overlaps, recoupe. So they are not satisfied with the overlaps, so they have to add the original word, which could go to a very funny exercise where you can imagine a translation adding all the words of the original text, because at a certain moment you say it doesn't work. So you know, for poetry sometimes we have one page with the original text and one page with the translation, but you can imagine a funny or absurd translation adding more and more words because you feel that something is impossible to render. And we have it here, the fall, shoot, the tomb, stone, tomb, and so they feel that there is a problem, there is a rest. Something puts them not in rest, they are unrest, unquiet with the translation. It is too difficult in a way, so it's an help. It's not only a question for Derrida. When you see a text by Heidegger or by Hegel, you have to explain a lot of things because the words are different and people are often doing new translation of a classic text. So here we are back to the French original without any added word, which is literally more satisfactory. But a more serious problem happened after the translation, and even with the addition of some words, they had to write a second book to explain the first one. So you have now 3 books: Glas by Derrida, Glas translated by our 2 fellows, and Glossary explaining what has to be explained in the book. And so Derrida wrote a small foreword. I didn't find it. I would have liked to find it. And here you see glossary, glossarist, glossary. They are continuing the game. But of course, there are some Sherlock Holmes translators looking for every detail, but it's not the same type of reading. You enter in an explanation process, an infinite explanation process, and it becomes, in a way, more complicated than the French original, which is already complicated because you have to know Hegel and Genet, and not a lot of people are specialists of those 2 subjects. But here, sometimes you say, oh, it would be easier to learn French, and then I would read it directly. As for Heidegger, it would be easier to learn German and to read it in German, even with a dictionary. And I will finish just with one example of the type of footnotes that you can find in many translations of this type of thing. And the question of translation and footnotes could be discussed for a very, very long period, because if you need a footnote every 2 lines, it becomes a total different text. And it becomes more and more complicated, because at a certain moment you should need footnotes added to the footnotes. And so this is still the infinite process. Here is just a discussion about one central word in Hegel's philosophy, which is Aufhebung. Probably you know that there is a dialectic by Hegel with antithesis, synthesis, and when you go from thesis to the contrary, antithesis, and then up, continuing, this is an Aufhebung. So you don't say 1, 0, 1, or A, B, A. You are doing A, B, C. There is a transformation. You integrate the contradiction. So this is called Aufhebung. I read it slowly. The term Aufhebung has also been defined as abolish, preserve, and transcend. Aufheben is used by Hegel to explain what happens when a thesis and antithesis interact, and in this sense is translated mainly as sublate. In a long footnote, the translator Alain Bass explained the Derridian translation, Derridian French translation proposed by Derrida for Aufheben. Derrida's translation is la relève. The word comes from the verb relever, French verb, which means to lift up, as does Aufheben. But relever also means to relay, to relieve, as when one soldier on duty relieves another. La relève de la garde. Buckingham Palace, you have la relève. Thus, the conserving and negating lift has become la relève. You see, there is still a guard in front of the palace, but it's not the same guard, but in a way, it's still a guard. So this is la relève. So la relève, a lift in which is inscribed an effect of substitution and difference. The effect of substitution and difference inscribed in the double meaning of Aufheben. This is just for one word, one central word in Hegel's and Derrida's philosophy, but just one word. So you imagine the complexity, because when you are a native French person, you directly feel this idea, this double meaning of la relève, to go up, to add some elements, to make a synthesis, and this, let's say, soldier meaning. And replacements by something very close or having the same function. And so we are here in the middle of a labyrinth, and we can understand why so many classic philosophers hate this type of thing and say, this is not philosophy anymore. But if you have another idea of philosophy, if you have the idea of reading philosophy is discovering many problems after every question and doubt of everything, and specifically doubt of the possibility of direct communication between civilizations and languages, then you understand how it can be creative and important. And if you love literature and poetry, you think also how important is it. And sometimes you don't have the idea of losing something, but of creating something different. And there is a nice last example, is the title of a book by Derrida, is called La Dissémination. La Dissémination, it means in French so many meanings. It's like little grains, and they go everywhere, and you cannot have a central or major meaning. When you read a text, you can always make new associations and new possibilities. And there was an Indian philosopher and political thinker, Homi Bhabha, and he created a new concept, which is dissemination. The nation is not a unity anymore, but with the idea of nation, with a country like India, but many other countries, even here in the United Kingdom, which can be not so united sometimes, you can make a dissemination. And then you are not thinking, is it a good translation or is it a bad translation? Because probably Derrida never thought, when he wrote La Dissémination, he was speaking more about philosophical and literary concept. He didn't, but when he heard this, he thought, this is a concept, this is an idea. You have done a philosophical gesture because you were creating something. And so we can think, yes, with the footnotes, we will always be sad and having the impression of losing something. But in another way, you can say, sometimes, with the idea of translation and the difficulty of translation, we can create new ideas. This is it.
Beautiful ending, thank you. We have just perhaps 2 minutes for questions if anyone has something to...
Don't ask me to explain the whole philosophy in Derrida in 2 minutes. I just gave you an idea of the complexity. I'm not a professional philosopher, I'm just a biographer, but I've tried to put some concept together.
He opens up the difficulty of multi-level of meaning in words and texts generally. Does he leave it at that, or does he offer some sort of solution for humble translators as opposed to philosophers?
He had a problem through his life because, as you know, he was more famous in the United States than in French-speaking countries. He became some sort of a star, and so he had to teach in English and to translate himself and to find some solution. He didn't feel able to write properly in English, but when he was speaking, he was adding some elements and so trying to think with the diversity of languages. And there is also a famous book with many authors about him, and it was called Deconstruction in America and Deconstruction is America. So there is in/is. And this was probably an idea of Derrida, it could have been. So deconstruction in America, deconstruction is America. And I've heard that at the end of his life, he was able, I'm not, he was able to suggest all the nuances between maybe and perhaps. So, of course, you can directly hear for a philosopher, be, maybe, which gives a very different association than perhaps. But I'm not able to do this. But it gives the impression that it became a very interesting problem for him, and he was able to do it with German and with English. He was, of course, not able to transform his thought for Japanese people, and where the basic concepts of the language are totally different. And the simple idea to be or not to be becomes a major problem for translators. So it's not necessary to be Derrida to feel that the difficulties come very quickly when the structure of a language is totally different. But he didn't do this only for the pleasure of complicated things, but as I hope to have showed it, to have us understanding the complexity of the act of thinking.